The claw marks started at the northwest corner of the barn and ran 16 feet across the frozen stone foundation, each groove deep enough to hold a man's thumb. Hadron Voss found them on a Tuesday morning in late winter, his breath fogging in the pre-dawn dark as he hauled feed sacks from the storehouse. He set the sack down and knelt, ran his fingers through the grooves. The stone was warm. That was wrong. Stone in the Kereth Valley didn't hold warmth in February, not at altitude, not after 3 weeks of frost that had turned the irrigation troughs to solid blocks and killed the last of the autumn grass. The valley floor sat at 4,000 feet, cradled between the ashward spine to the west and the black volcanic ridges of the thorn wall to the east, and by this time of year the cold had teeth. But the stone under Hadron's fingers was warm the way a kettle is warm an hour after the fire dies, residual, fading, as if something had pressed against it recently and left its heat behind. He followed the marks around the barn's foundation. They curved southeast, toward the old calving pasture, the fenced 2-acre lot he hadn't used since the last of his livestock died 3 years ago. Beyond the pasture, the ground dropped sharply into the gorge, where the river Keth ran black and fast between walls of volcanic basalt. He could hear it now, the deep muttering of winter water grinding through stone. The claw marks ended at the gorge's edge. Below, in the half-light, he could see the shelf of rock that jutted 20 feet above the waterline, a natural ledge, hidden from above by the gorge's overhang. Something had scraped the frost off it, something large. Hadron stood there for a long time. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. He was 53 years old, and he had been a dragon keeper for 30 of those years, 12 at the Kereth Valley Imperial Waystation before it was decommissioned, and 18 since, tending an empty station on a pension that arrived 4 months late when it arrived at all. He knew claw marks. He knew scale scrapes and tail drag patterns and the thermal signatures that a dragon left on stone. He knew what he was looking at. He went back to the barn and finished the morning chores with the mechanical steadiness of a man whose hands knew the work even when his mind was somewhere else entirely. Fed the 2 goats. Broke the ice on the water trough. Checked the heating coils in the old incubation chamber, a room he maintained out of habit, even though it hadn't held an egg in 14 years. Not since the last clutch failed, and the Imperial Dragon Service pulled its operations from the valley and reassigned every keeper to stations closer to the capital. Every keeper except Hadron. He had refused the transfer. Told the service coordinator that someone needed to stay and maintain the waystation in case the migration routes shifted back. The coordinator had looked at him with the tired patience of a bureaucrat who knew the routes would never shift back, signed the exemption papers, and left. 14 years. The waystation had been built to house 6 keepers and up to 12 transient dragons. Now it housed 1 man, 2 goats, and a barn full of equipment he kept in working order for a purpose that no longer existed. He calibrated the thermal sensors each spring, replaced the cable on the cargo winch each autumn, filed maintenance reports with a regional office that had stopped reading them a decade ago. He finished the chores and went to the gorge. The descent was a 30-foot scramble down a path he'd cut into the basalt years ago for water access. The cold hit different down here, wet, mineral sharp, the spray from the river coating every surface in a thin glaze of ice. He reached the ledge and stopped. She was smaller than he expected. That was his first coherent thought, which surprised him, because he hadn't known he was expecting anything. She lay on the ledge with her body curled tight against the gorge wall, her tail wrapped around her hind legs, her wings folded so close to her ribs that at first he thought she didn't have wings at all. Her scales were the dull gray-blue of old slate, cracked in places, the edges lifting like bark on a dead tree. Ice crystals had formed in the gaps between the plates along her spine. She was breathing. He could see it, the slow, thin expansion of her ribcage, each breath shallow enough that it barely moved the frost on the stone beneath her. Her head was tucked under her left forelimb, hidden, as if she had been trying to keep warm or trying to hide or both. Hadron crouched 6 feet away, close enough to see, far enough to give her room. "Hey," he said quietly. The word came out rough. He hadn't spoken to another living thing besides the goats in about 2 weeks, and his voice had the rusty quality of disuse. She didn't move, but the rhythm of her breathing changed, a slight quickening, a held quality, the way an animal breathes when it knows it's been found and is deciding whether that's a threat. He waited. The river thundered below. Spray misted the ledge. His knees ached against the frozen stone. After 3 minutes he counted them, the keeper's habit of timing a dragon's response interval. She moved her forelimb, just enough to expose her head, and Hadron saw her eyes. They were white, not clouded, not milky with age or disease. White, smooth and featureless like river stones, both of them. She had been born blind. The breed markers were there for someone who knew how to read them. The jaw ridges were narrow, a northern lineage. The horn stubs above her brow were blunted, filed, or broken decades ago. The scale pattern along her throat was the irregular mosaic of a Ketharan ridge, dragon, the same subspecies that had used this valley as a migration corridor for 3,000 years before the roots shifted, and the species was reclassified from active to functionally absent. She was maybe 14, 15 years old, young for a dragon, but the condition of her scales, the thinness of her frame, the way her muscles had wasted along her shoulders and haunches, she looked ancient. She looked like a dragon who had been surviving rather than living, and who had been doing it alone for a very long time. Hadron sat down on the ledge. He didn't approach her. He didn't reach out. He sat with his back against the gorge wall, 6 feet away, and he breathed quietly, and he let the silence do what silence does between a keeper and a dragon who doesn't yet know whether to trust. 20 minutes passed. His legs went numb. The spray soaked through his coat. She lifted her head. The motion was slow, careful, the motion of a creature who has learned that sudden movements attract predators. She turned her blind white eyes toward him, and he felt it, the faintest pulse of warmth against his skin, a thermal probe, the way a dragon reads its environment when it can't see. She was mapping him with body heat. "I'm still here," he said. Her nostrils flared. She drew in his scent, the feed dust, the goat smell, the machine oil from the incubation chamber's heating coils, the old leather of his keeper's jacket that he still wore even though the insignia had faded to nothing. A long, slow breath in, processing. Then she made a sound, not a growl, not a call. A vibration in her chest so low it was more sensation than sound. He felt it in his sternum, in his teeth, in the bones of his hands where they rested on his knees. A subaudible frequency that traveled through the basalt ledge and up through his body like a second heartbeat. Hadron closed his eyes. He hadn't felt that frequency in 14 years. The last time had been in the incubation chamber, sitting beside a clutch of eggs that were losing temperature, pressing his hands against their shells and willing them to hold on. They hadn't. But the frequency, the low, seeking pulse that a dragon sends out when it's asking, "Are you there? Are you safe? Are you mine?" That sound he remembered perfectly. "Yeah," he said, his voice cracked. "I hear you." He climbed back to the station. His hands were shaking again, and his coat was soaked through, and he stood in the barn for 5 minutes with his forehead pressed against a support beam, breathing. Then he went to the storehouse and pulled the emergency thermal blankets, military grade, reflective, designed to retain a dragon's body heat during medical transport. He hadn't touched them since the station was decommissioned. They were still sealed in their original packaging. He took 4 blankets, a field medical kit, a canteen of water warmed on the barn's heating coil, and the portable temperature scanner from the incubation chamber. He went back down. She hadn't moved. He approached slowly, narrating each step the way he'd been trained, coming closer now. "Going to check your temperature. This won't hurt." The words were muscle memory from decades of keeper protocol, and they came out in the calm, even cadence of a man who had spent his life speaking to creatures that understood tone better than language. He pressed the scanner against the base of her neck, behind the jaw ridge. Her body temperature was 81 degrees. Normal for a Catharin Ridge dragon was 112. She was hypothermic, critically. At 81, a dragon's metabolic functions begin to cascade toward shutdown. The organs slow, the fire glands stop producing heat, the muscles lock. Below 75, the process becomes irreversible. "All right," Hadron said. He spread the first thermal blanket across her back, tucking the edges under her body with the careful precision of a man making a hospital bed. She flinched when the material touched her cracked scales, and a sound came from her throat, a thin, rasping whine that went through Hadron like a blade. "I know," he said. "I know it hurts. The scales are lifting and the blanket's catching. I'm going to be careful." He worked the blanket under her gently, sliding his hands between the damaged scales with the lightest pressure he could manage. His fingers found things he didn't want to find. A ridge of scar tissue along her left side where something had torn through the scale plate and healed badly. A section of her right wing membrane that was shredded not recently, but old damage, years old, the tears sealed with the fibrous scar tissue that meant she had never been treated. She couldn't fly. Maybe had never been able to. He wrapped her in all 4 blankets. He sat beside her and held the canteen to her mouth, tilting it so the warm water ran along the edge of her jaw, and she drank in slow, painful pulls, her blind eyes turned toward him the whole time. The temperature scanner read 83 after an hour, 85 after 2. The trajectory was right, but it was slow, and the February cold was working against him. The gorge funneled wind off the river and the spray kept soaking through the blankets. She couldn't stay here. The problem was simple and enormous. She couldn't climb. Her wing damage meant she couldn't fly, and her muscle wasting meant the 30-foot scramble up the gorge path was impossible. A healthy dragon could have leaped it. A keeper station with a full crew would have rigged a harness and used the cargo winch. Hadron had 1 set of hands and a winch that hadn't been maintained for general loads in over a decade. He went up. He spent 3 hours on the winch replacing the cable that had corroded, testing the motor, reinforcing the anchor bolts in the basalt. His fingers bled where the frayed cable caught them. He ignored it. When the motor seized on the 3rd test cycle, he pulled the housing apart, cleaned the contacts with the solvent he kept for the incubation chamber's thermostat relays, reassembled it, and ran the test again. It held. He rigged a sling from cargo netting and hauled it down to the ledge. She let him work the sling under her body without resistance. Either she trusted him or she was too weak to fight. He suspected both. He cinched the netting carefully around her midsection, padding the contact points with the thermal blankets so the mesh wouldn't press into her damaged scales. The whole time he talked keeper's protocol, the steady narration of a man describing what his hands were doing before they did it, giving her a chance to pull away. She didn't pull away. When the sling tightened and her weight shifted, she pressed her blind head against his shoulder. The contact lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. He felt the subaudible pulse again, transmitted through the bone of his shoulder and into his chest. The frequency was different this time. Not "Are you safe?" Closer to "I trust you," or maybe simply "Don't let go." The winch groaned. The cable sang. Hadron stood at the top of the gorge with his hand on the motor housing, feeling every vibration, listening for the sound of stress in the anchor bolts. She rose from the gorge slowly, swinging in the sling, her blind head turning as the air changed around her, warmer air, drier, the smells of the barn and the feed, and the old familiar scent of keeper's oil that Hadron hadn't realized he carried until she lifted her nose and breathed it in. He guided the sling through the barn doors and lowered her onto the floor of the incubation chamber. The heating coils were already running. He'd set them to full before going down the first time in 14 years. The chamber had been brought to operational temperature. The stone floor radiated warmth. The air was dense and still, and carried the faint mineral smell of heated basalt that every keeper in the service associated with eggs and new life. She settled onto the warm stone and made that sound again, the subaudible pulse, the seeking frequency. But this time it was different, stronger, not a question but a statement. Here, I'm here. Hadron sat on the chamber floor with his back against the wall. His arms ached. His coat was torn where the cable had caught it. He was exhausted in a way that went past physical and into a territory he didn't have words for. He watched her breathe, the rhythm deepening, steadying, the thermal blankets rising and falling, her body drawing heat from the stone the way a drought-starved plant draws water. Her temperature was up to 91. He should report this. The protocol was clear, even for a decommissioned station. Any Dragon contact required notification to the regional service office within 24 hours. The regional office would send a team. The team would assess the Dragon, determine its status, and either transport it to a care facility, or, if the prognosis was poor, authorize euthanasia. A blind, flightless, malnourished Ketharan Ridge dragon with no registered lineage and no bonded keeper would be classified as unviable. He knew exactly how that assessment would go. He did not make the call. Instead, he went to the storehouse and pulled the feeding supplies he'd maintained alongside everything else. The protein concentrate designed for convalescing dragons, the mineral supplements, the warming troughs. Every canister labeled in his own handwriting, every expiration date tracked in the station log. He mixed a batch of recovery feed, heated it, and brought it to the chamber in a shallow basin. She ate with the desperate focus of a creature who hadn't had a reliable meal in years, her blind head bent to the basin, her jaws working slowly because the muscles had weakened. He held the basin steady and tilted it when the level dropped too low for her to reach. He named her 3 days in. He hadn't meant to. Keepers were trained not to name unregistered dragons. It compromised objectivity, the training manual said, and objectivity was essential for the difficult decisions the service sometimes required. But on the 3rd morning, when he came into the incubation chamber and she lifted her head and turned her white eyes toward the door, and that low pulse rolled through the stone floor and into his feet, the name came out of his mouth without permission. Morning, Kess. She made a sound, a short, warm exhalation, not quite a purr, not quite a sigh. A sound he hadn't heard a dragon make since his last clutch failed, the sound of recognition. The clutch. He tried not to think about it, but the incubation chamber made not thinking impossible. The chamber was where it had happened, 6 eggs, laid by a Ketharan Ridge female named Sareth, who had been the station's last resident dragon, a scarred old matriarch who had used the valley corridor for 40 years, and who had chosen the Karath waystation for her final clutch because the thermal profile of the basalt floor was the closest match to the deep mountain nesting sites her species preferred. Hadron had tended those eggs for 72 days, turned them twice daily, monitored their internal temperatures with the embryonic scanner, watching the tiny thermal signatures inside each shell grow brighter and more complex as the hatchlings developed. On day 68, the first egg had started to rock, a gentle, rhythmic motion that meant the hatchling was testing its shell, preparing to break through. Hadron had sat beside it for 14 hours, hands ready to assist if the hatchling struggled, the way the training manual described. The rocking stopped at hour 15. The thermal signature inside the egg dimmed and went still. One by one, over the next 4 days, the other 5 eggs did the same. The embryonic scanner showed the cause, a fungal contamination in the shell matrix, something the eggs had picked up during transport to the station. By the time the symptoms manifested, the infection was systemic. There was nothing Hadron could have done. The service's post-mortem report confirmed it. But the report didn't mention the sound an egg makes when the life inside it stops, a faint, wet settling, like sand shifting in an hourglass. Hadron heard that sound in his sleep for 2 years after. Sareth had left the valley the morning after the last egg failed. She had walked out of the incubation chamber, crossed the yard, and launched from the calving pasture without looking back. Hadron had watched her diminish against the ashward spine until she was a speck, and then nothing. She never returned. The following month, the service decommissioned the station. And now Kess lay on the same stone floor where those eggs had cooled, and the chamber's heating coils hummed at the same frequency, and the basalt radiated the same mineral warmth. And Hadron fed her twice a day, and cleaned her wounds and checked her temperature, and did not think about the eggs, because thinking about them would mean acknowledging that he was doing this again, investing himself in something fragile that might not survive, and that acknowledgement was a luxury his concentration could not afford. Her recovery was slow and it was fragile. The hypothermia had damaged the fine capillaries in her extremities, the tips of her claws turned black, and 2 of them fell off during the first week. The cracked scales along her spine wept fluid that he cleaned and dressed twice a day, wrapping the worst sections in medicated gauze from the field kit. The shredded wing membrane was beyond repair. The scar tissue was too old and too extensive. She would never fly. But she ate. Every morning and every evening she ate the recovery feed, and her temperature climbed 95, 98, 101. Her scales began to seal. The cracked edges that had been lifting like dead bark slowly tightened against her body, and in places he could see the original color emerging beneath the dull gray, a deep smoke blue that caught the light from the chamber's heating coils with a faint iridescence, like oil on water. On day 7, a complication arrived that had nothing to do with biology. A service courier drone dropped a notice at the station's mail post a quarterly maintenance audit, scheduled for day 12. The service hadn't audited the Karath waystation in 3 years, but apparently the regional office had cycled its roster, and some new administrator had noticed an active status facility with no logged dragon activity in 14 years, and decided to investigate. The notice was signed by a field inspector named Avon Drell, and it requested access to all station facilities including the incubation chamber. Hadron read the notice twice. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and went to stand in the barn doorway, looking at the incubation chamber door. Through the gap he could hear Kess's breathing steady now, deeper than before, the rhythm of a body that was learning to trust warmth again. Hiding a full-size dragon from a service inspector in a 40 by 30 foot incubation chamber was not among the skills the keeper training manual had covered. He spent the next 2 days preparing. He moved Kess to the barn's rear storage bay, a space originally designed for hay bales and equipment overflow, insulated by 6 inches of stone wall. He ran an extension from the incubation chamber's heating coils to the storage bay, threading the cable through the wall conduit that had once carried water lines. He laid thermal blankets on the floor, covered them with hay for additional insulation and concealment. Kess resisted the move at first, her blind head swinging in confusion at the unfamiliar space, her subaudible pulse broadcasting distress. He talked her through it, the keeper's narration steady and patient. "New room, same warmth, I'm right here. This is temporary." She settled. By the time Inspector Drell arrived, a young woman in a crisp service uniform, her data tablet out before she'd crossed the threshold. Kess was sleeping in the storage bay under 2 feet of hay, her temperature holding at 98, her breathing muffled by the insulation. The inspection lasted 4 hours. Drell was thorough in the way of someone proving herself to a new supervisor. She checked the heating coils, the thermal sensors, the winch mechanism, the feed stores. She noted the incubation chamber's operational status and asked why Hadron kept it running. He told her the truth, or a version of it. The chamber's thermal profile was calibrated to a precision that would take months to restore if he let it go cold, and the Ketharin Ridge migration routes were overdue for a natural cycle shift. Drell looked at him the way the service coordinator had looked at him 14 years ago, patient, slightly pitying, the expression of a professional who understood obsolescence. "The routes aren't shifting back, Keeper Voss. The climate data is clear. The Ketharan Ridge subspecies has established permanent corridors 400 miles north. Climate data doesn't account for everything, Hadron said. She made a note on her tablet. She inspected the storage bay door but didn't open it. The hay visible through the gap looked like ordinary storage, and the heating cable running through the wall conduit was hidden behind a shelf of empty feed canisters that Hadron had positioned the night before. She filed her report, classified the station as maintained, non-operational, and left. Hadron stood in the yard and watched her transport disappear over the ridgeline. Then he went to the storage bay and moved the hay and checked Kess's temperature and sat beside her while his heartbeat slowed to something approaching normal. She pressed her head against his knee, and the subaudible pulse that rolled through his bones said something that didn't need translation. On day 9, the first medical crisis hit. He came in at dawn and found her temperature had dropped back to 88 overnight. The heating coils were still running. The chamber was warm. The drop was internal. Her fire glands had stuttered, a metabolic hiccup that happened when a dragon's body tried to restart systems that had been dormant too long. She was shivering, her scales buzzing against the stone, the vibration audible from across the room. Hadron knelt beside her and pressed both hands flat against her neck, just behind the jaw ridge, where the skin was thinnest and heat could transfer fastest. Keeper's thermal assist, a technique he'd learned 30 years ago and had hoped he'd never need. His body heat was a fraction of what a dragon required, but it was a signal. It told the fire glands that warmth existed, that the system could restart, that someone was here and the effort was worth making. He stayed like that for 4 hours, his hands cramped, his shoulders locked. Kess pressed closer, curling her body around his legs, her tail wrapping around his boots, seeking every degree of warmth his body could offer. At noon, her temperature ticked up, 89, 90, 91. By evening, she was back to 98, and Hadron's hands felt like they'd been crushed in a vice. She was beautiful under the damage. The realization hit him fully in the second week, when she stood for the first time on trembling legs and shook herself, and the scales along her flanks rippled with that smoke blue shimmer, and her blind white eyes turned toward the sound of his breathing with an expression he could only describe as knowing. The countdown started on day 17. Hadron found the first mark in the morning, a spot on the inside of his left wrist, just below the heel of his hand. It looked like a bruise at first, a dark smudge, roughly circular, about the size of a coin. He pressed on it. No pain. He dismissed it. By evening it had spread. The dark smudge was now a pattern, not random, not organic, geometric. The lines branched and connected like the veining on a leaf, or the pattern of frost on glass, except they were the exact blue-gray of Kess's scales. He knew what it was. He'd read the old texts in the station's library during the long winters, the accounts from the early centuries of the dragon service, before the bond protocols were standardized and the keeping profession was regulated. The accounts described something called the ashkel, the sharing, a phenomenon that occurred when a dragon's bond with its keeper deepened past the subaudible communication and into something physiological. The dragon's thermal signature would begin to register in the keeper's body. The keeper's heartbeat would synchronize with the dragon's, and the exchange would manifest on the skin scale patterns appearing on the keeper's body, drawn there by the dragon's subconscious heat mapping, a slow rewriting of one biology by another. The old accounts were clear about 2 things. First, the ashkel was irreversible once it progressed past a certain point. The bond deepened until the 2 organisms functioned as a single thermal system. Second, it was not free. The energy for the transfer came from the keeper's own metabolic reserves. The dragon's body healed, the keeper's body paid. The early accounts listed it among the known causes of keeper mortality, alongside fire gland exposure and territorial mauling. They noted it without sentimentality, the keeper's choice. Hadron sat on the floor of the incubation chamber that night, his back against the wall, his sleeve rolled up, watching the pattern spread slowly across his wrist. Kess lay 3 feet away, her head resting on the warm stone, her breathing steady and deep for the first time since he'd found her. Her temperature was 104, the highest it had been. He did the math. He was not a scientist, but he was a keeper, and keepers learned to read the numbers. Kess's recovery rate had accelerated sharply in the last 4 days, exactly correlating with the appearance of the mark on his wrist. Her metabolic output had jumped from a dangerous plateau to a climbing curve. Her scales were sealing faster. Her muscle mass was returning. Meanwhile, his own body temperature had dropped 2 degrees. He felt it, a persistent chill that no amount of clothing could address, a deep bone cold that reminded him of the gorge ledge where he'd found her. He should stop, pull back, limit contact. The bond was driving the Ashkill, and reducing proximity would slow it, maybe halt it. He could call the service, report her, let the proper medical teams take over. They'd take her to a facility with equipment and staff and protocols designed for exactly this situation. She'd be assessed. She'd probably be classified unviable and euthanized. But at least he wouldn't be dying on a barn floor in the Kereth Valley for a dragon nobody had registered, and nobody would miss. He pulled his sleeve down and went to heat the morning feed. On day 18, Kess did something she had never done before. She followed him out of the barn. Not blindly, not stumbling. She navigated the doorway by thermal mapping, turned her head to locate the sun's warmth on the eastern fence, and walked across the frozen yard with a deliberation that made Hadron stop in his tracks. She moved past him, past the feed trough, past the confused goats, and went directly to the old calving pasture gate. She stood there with her nose pressed against the wood, her blind eyes turned south toward the gorge, and she hummed. A single note sustained, the subaudible frequency climbing just high enough for Hadron to hear the overtone, a thin, clear sound, like a glass rim rubbed with a wet finger. She held the note for 40 seconds, then silence. Then the note again, the same pitch, the same duration, the same precise interval between repetitions, a pattern, a signal. Hadron walked to her and put his hand on her neck, below the jaw ridge. The scales were warm and smooth where they had sealed the smoke-blue iridescence bright under the morning sun. Through his palm, he felt the vibration of the note traveling through her body, through his hand, up his arm, and into the scale pattern that had now reached his elbow. The pattern flared faintly with each repetition. "Who are you calling?" he asked. He didn't expect an answer, and she didn't give one in words. But she pressed her head against his hand, and the note changed, dropped half an octave, softened, became the seeking pulse he knew, the one that said, "Are you here?" She held that frequency against his palm for 5 seconds, and then she turned back to the gate and sent the other note again, the high, clear signal aimed at the horizon. She was sending 2 calls, one for him, one for someone else. On day 20, his neighbor Torin Gale rode up to the station. Torin ran the goat farm 2 valleys east and checked on Hadron every few weeks, mostly out of obligation. He was a large, quiet man who had never understood why Hadron stayed at the station, but had long since stopped asking. He noticed Hadron's hands, the tremor, the way Hadron gripped the coffee mug with both palms to keep it steady. "You look like hell," Torin said. "Flu," Hadron said. Torin looked at the barn. Through the closed doors, the faint rumble of Kess's breathing was audible, a low, rhythmic vibration that could be mistaken for equipment if you didn't know better. "Your heating system sounds off." "Old coils, I'm replacing them." Torin didn't press. He left an extra bag of grain for the goats and rode out, and Hadron watched him go with the quiet guilt of a man who has chosen a secret that might outlive him. That evening, Hadron sat in the incubation chamber and did something he hadn't done in 14 years. He opened the old station manual, the 300-page bound volume that the service issued to every keeper upon certification, and turned to the section on bond formation. He read it by the light of the heating coils, his back against the wall, Kess sleeping 3 feet away with her head resting on the edge of his boot. The manual's language was clinical. Bond formation between keeper and dragon proceeds through 4 documented stages: proximity tolerance days 1-7, thermal synchronization days 7-14, subaudible communication days 14-28, and physiological integration day 28+. The 4th stage, historically termed the ashkill or sharing, involves measurable transfer of metabolic energy from keeper to dragon, resulting in accelerated healing in the dragon and proportional metabolic deficit in the keeper. The 4th stage has been observed in fewer than 200 documented cases over the service's 3,000-year history. In all documented cases, the bond was initiated by the dragon and accepted, consciously or unconsciously, by the keeper. He turned the page. The next section was titled Keeper Mortality and the Ashkill. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph listed the statistics. Of the documented ashkill cases, 41 had resulted in keeper death. The second paragraph described the mechanism. The metabolic deficit compounds at an accelerating rate, and without external intervention specifically, the thermal replenishment that only another dragon of sufficient metabolic mass can provide. The keeper's body temperature drops below the threshold of organ function within 30 to 60 days. The third paragraph was a single sentence. Keepers who suspect they have entered the 4th stage of bond formation are required to report to the nearest service medical facility immediately. Hadron closed the manual. He looked at the pattern on his arm, now past his elbow, the lines branching toward his shoulder with the inevitability of roots growing through soil. He looked at Kess, whose temperature was 106, whose scales gleamed, whose muscles had filled, whose breathing was the deep, regular rhythm of a healthy dragon at rest. 30 to 60 days. He was on day 20. The pattern was accelerating. The marks spread. By the end of the 3rd week, the scale pattern covered his left forearm from wrist to elbow. The lines were intricate and precise, each one corresponding to a specific plate on Kess's body. He could match them, 1-to-1, his skin to her scales. Where her cracked plates were healing, his pattern was darkest. Where her damage was worst, the lines on his arm pulsed with a faint warmth that he could feel even through his sleeve. His body temperature dropped to 96, then 95. He started wearing 2 coats inside the barn. His hands trembled when he mixed the feed. The fatigue was a living thing, a weight that settled deeper each morning and didn't lift. He slept 12 hours and woke exhausted. The walk from his cot to the incubation chamber, 40 feet, required a rest stop at the barn door. Kess, by contrast, was transforming. Her scales had fully sealed. The smoke-blue iridescence that had been hidden under years of damage now covered her entire body, and in the light from the barn windows it shifted through shades of blue and gray and silver like the sky at the edge of a storm. She had gained weight. Her muscles had filled. She held her head high when she walked carefully, because she was still blind, but with a grace that was unmistakably draconic, the measured confidence of a creature built by 3,000 years of mountain-bred lineage. She couldn't see, but she navigated the barn and the yard by thermal mapping, and by the subaudible echoes her seeking pulse bounced off walls and fences and the 2 confused goats. She knew where Hadron was at all times. Her blind eyes would track his movement through the room, her head turning to follow his body heat with a precision that was eerie and tender in equal measure. When his temperature dropped sharply one evening, a sudden dip to 93 that left him dizzy and gripping the barn wall, she crossed the chamber in 4 steps and pressed her body against his, wrapping her tail around his legs, and held him there, until the dizziness passed and his temperature climbed back to a grudging 94. She knew what was happening to him. He was certain of it. She found the old calving pasture on day 24. Hadron had left the gate open, an oversight born of fatigue, and she had walked through it, across the dead grass and the frozen mud, to the fence line that overlooked the gorge. He found her standing at the edge, her nose lifted into the wind coming up from the river, Her blind eyes turned toward the east. She was calling. He felt it before he heard it. The subaudible pulse that he'd come to associate with her seeking frequency, but amplified, deepened, thrown outward with a force that vibrated the fence posts and sent the goats scrambling for the barn. Not a question this time. A broadcast. The sound rolled through the basalt bedrock and into the valley like a bell struck in a well, and the overtones climbed into frequencies that Hadron couldn't hear but felt in his ribs, in his sinuses, in the scale pattern on his arm that suddenly blazed with heat. She was calling for her kind. The Ketharan Ridge dragons had been functionally absent for 14 years. That was the service's classification. It meant the migration routes had shifted, the breeding populations had moved north, the valley was empty. But functionally absent was a statistical term, and statistics didn't account for a blind dragon who had never left the valley, who had survived alone in a gorge for 14 years, who had been sending that subaudible pulse into the bedrock every night for as long as she'd been alive. Calling not randomly, not from distress, calling the way a lighthouse calls patient, repeating, tireless, a signal that said, "I'm here, come back, the valley is still here." Hadron's knees gave. He sat in the dead grass with his back against the fence post and watched her call, and the pattern on his arm pulsed in rhythm with her broadcast, and his body temperature dropped another degree. He could feel the cost of the broadcast. The Ashkill translated her effort into his deficit, each pulse drawing another fraction of warmth from his body and feeding it into her call. He didn't stop her. He didn't have the right. And somewhere in the part of his mind that still functioned with the cold precision of a trained keeper, he understood something that the service manuals had never stated and the bond formation literature had never acknowledged. The Ashkill was not a malfunction. It was not a disease, not an accident, not a system failure. It was a choice, the deepest choice a keeper's body could make, deeper than conscious will, a cellular-level decision to say this creature matters more than my comfort, more than my safety, more than my continued existence in the form I currently occupy. The pattern on his skin was not a symptom. It was a signature, the body's way of writing what the heart had already signed. On day 26, Torrin Gale came again. This time he didn't accept the flu excuse. He looked at Hadron's face, the sunken cheeks, the blue tint under the fingernails, the way Hadron gripped the doorframe to stay upright, and he said, "You need a doctor." "I need you to leave me alone," Hadron said. His voice was steady. The steadiness surprised him. Torrin looked past Hadron's shoulder, into the barn. Kes was in the incubation chamber, out of the direct line of sight, but the low hum of her breathing carried. "What's that sound?" "Generator." Torrin held Hadron's gaze for a long beat. Whatever he saw there made him step back. "I'll be back in 3 days. If you look worse, I'm calling the Valley Clinic whether you like it or not." Hadron nodded. 3 days. He'd already done the math. 3 days was exactly how long his trajectory gave him before the deficit pushed his temperature below 90. Below 90, the manual said, cognitive function begins to degrade. Below 88, motor control fails. Below 85, the body starts shutting down systems to preserve the core. He had, by his best estimate, about 12 days before the numbers killed him. Unless someone answered the call. On day 28, the first answer came. It wasn't a dragon. It was a tremor, a deep vibration in the bedrock that woke Hadron at 3 in the morning, his cot shaking, the heating coils in the incubation chamber humming with resonance. He lay in the dark and listened. The vibration lasted 11 seconds and then stopped. 2 minutes later it came again, and again. A pattern, 3 long pulses, a pause, 3 long pulses. He recognized the rhythm. It was the response to a seeking call, the counter-frequency that a dragon sends back to confirm location and intent. It was coming from the northeast, from deep in the ashward spine, from a distance he couldn't calculate but that felt, through the bedrock, like miles. Kes was on her feet in the incubation chamber, her head high, her blind eyes wide, her entire body rigid with attention. She wasn't calling anymore. She was listening. And the sound she made in response, a low, trembling note that made the heating coils ring sympathetically, was the sound of a creature who has just learned that the thing she has been saying for 14 years has finally been heard. The counter-frequency came again the next night, and the next, each time closer, each time stronger. Hadron could feel it now without touching the ground. The pulses traveled through the barn's foundation and into his body, and the scale pattern on his arm resonated with each burst like a tuning fork. On day 29, he did something that required more energy than he had, because it required hope, and hope is expensive when your body is running at a deficit. He opened the old station charts, the geological survey maps that showed the Ashward Spines Valley network in contour lines and thermal vent markers, and he spread them on the barn floor and pressed his hands flat against the stone and listened. The counter-frequency came at midnight, as it had the 2 previous nights, and this time he felt not just the direction, but the texture of the signal, the way it bounced off certain rock formations and passed through others, the way the basalt conducted differently from the limestone, the way a specific harmonic told him the source was moving through a narrow valley with high walls and a river at the bottom. He cross-referenced the harmonic signature with the chart. The Ashward Spine had 11 such valleys. Only 3 of them ran northeast to southwest, toward the Karath corridor. He triangulated. Whatever was coming was moving at roughly 30 miles per day, fast for a formation, slow for a lone dragon. A formation then. Multiple dragons, matching pace to the slowest member, the way migration groups travel. They were in the Vithrin Narrows, approximately 150 miles northeast. At 30 miles per day, arrival was 5 days out. 5 days. He checked his temperature. 93. He checked the manual's mortality table. At his current rate of decline, roughly half a degree per day, he would hit 88 in 10 days. That left a margin of 5 days. 5 days of functional consciousness after the dragons arrived, assuming they arrived on schedule, assuming they were friendly, assuming the matriarch, because only a matriarch could settle a migration debt. The old texts were clear on that, assumed the matriarch was among them. A lot of assumptions for a man whose body was slowly shutting down in a barn in the middle of nowhere. He folded the charts. He went to the storehouse and began preparing not for himself, but for them. Feed stocks for 30-plus dragons would exceed his supply within a week, but he could stretch the protein concentrate with grain supplements from his personal stores. He checked the water capacity. The river provided unlimited flow, but the troughs could only serve 8 dragons at a time. He built 2 additional troughs from cargo containers, cutting them lengthwise with the plasma cutter he'd maintained for 14 years and never used. The work took 6 hours and left him so exhausted that he slept on the barn floor, too spent to reach his cot. Kes found him there and lay beside him, her body curved around his back, her warmth keeping his temperature from dropping below 92. He woke to the counter-frequency, closer, stronger. The barn floor vibrated with it. On day 30, Hadron woke to find that the scale pattern had crossed the center line of his chest. He lay on his cot in the gray pre-dawn and looked down at himself. The lines had been creeping toward his sternum for days, but overnight they had breached the midline and spread across his right pectoral, branching in the same precise geometry, each line a mirror of a specific scale on Kes's body, the correspondence exact enough to map. His left side was now fully covered from shoulder to hip, the smoke blue lines dense and interconnected, the older marks near his wrist so deep they looked tattooed. The newer marks on his right chest were lighter, tentative, as if the bond was testing new territory. He pressed his palm flat against his sternum. 2 heartbeats, his own thready 64 beats per minute, weaker than it should have been, and Kes's, a slower, deeper rhythm at 52 beats per minute, the strong, measured cadence of a dragon in full health. Her heartbeat was louder in his chest than his own. The feed needed mixing, the water trough needed breaking, the goats needed grain. He cataloged the tasks the way he always did. the keeper's morning inventory, and then he closed his eyes and breathed and tried to remember what warmth felt like when it came from inside your own body, rather than from a dragon's thermal echo. He made it through the morning chores by moving slowly and resting between each task. The walk from the barn to the water trough 30 feet required 2 stops. The walk back required 3. Kes watched him from the incubation chamber doorway, her blind head tracking his movement with increasing agitation, her subaudible pulse broadcasting a note he hadn't heard before higher than the seeking frequency, sharper. Distress. She could feel his deficit through the bond. She knew what the numbers meant. When he sat down on the barn floor to rest, she crossed the space between them and lay down beside him, pressing the full length of her body against his left side. The contact flooded him with warmth, the Ashkel's recycled heat, his own energy returning through the circuit, and for 20 minutes the cold retreated and his hands stopped shaking and his vision cleared. But he could feel the cost on the back end, the way the warmth pulled from his reserves to replenish hers, the deficit deepening each time the loop completed. The manual had called it a compound withdrawal. He was paying interest on his own borrowed heat. On day 31, he couldn't stand up. His alarm sounded at 5, the way it always did. He swung his legs off the cot, put his feet on the floor, pushed himself upright, and his vision grayed and he went back down. His temperature was 91.4. The scale pattern covered his chest. Each line pulsed faintly with the smoke-blue iridescence of Kes's scales, and when he pressed his hand against his ribs he could feel a second heartbeat, not his own. Hers. Carried through the bond, running alongside his pulse, steady and strong while his own faltered. He rested for 20 minutes and tried again. This time he made it up. He shuffled to the incubation chamber and found Kes pacing a slow, measured circuit of the room, her head turning, her nostrils testing the air. She stopped when he entered and came to him, pressing her head against his chest. The contact sent a wave of warmth through his body that was almost painful in its relief, like stepping into a hot bath after hours in the cold. His temperature climbed 3 degrees in the time she held her head against him. But he knew the math. The warmth she was giving back was his own warmth, recycled through the bond and returned. The Ashkel was a closed circuit. She drew energy from him through the bond. The energy healed her body and radiated back as thermal comfort. But the cycle was lossy. Each pass cost him a fraction more than it returned. He was running a deficit, and the deficit was compounding. He mixed the feed. He cleaned her scales. He dressed the last of the healing wounds along her side, where the scar tissue had finally closed over and the new scales were pushing through small, dark, perfect plates that had never known damage. He checked the winch and the barn doors and the water trough. He fed the goats. He did the work because the work was what he had, and stopping was not something he knew how to do. The morning of day 33 was clear and bitterly cold, the sky the hard blue of high altitude in winter, and the ashward spine stood along the western horizon like a wall of white teeth. Hadron was in the yard, leaning against the fence because standing unsupported required more energy than he could spare. He was watching the sky out of habit, the keeper's habit of scanning for dragons on approach, when the first shadow crossed the sun. He thought it was a cloud. Then the shadow moved against the wind, and the shape of it resolved, and his breath stopped. She was enormous, twice the size of Kes, her wingspan wide enough to throw a shadow across the entire yard. Her scales were deep bronze gold, burnished by altitude and sun, and they caught the winter light with the same iridescence that Kes's scales had revealed the Ketharin Ridge signature, the storm edge shimmer. She came in low over the calving pasture, her wing beats slow and thunderous, each downstroke displacing the frost from the grass in expanding white circles, and she landed on the frozen ground with a controlled grace that cracked the earth in a perfect ring around her. Behind her 3 more, smaller, younger, their scales darker adolescents, a year or 2 from maturity. They landed in formation, fanning out behind the bronze dragon with the disciplined spacing of a trained flight wing. Then 2 more, larger, flanking, and another pair coming in from the east, riding the thermal off the Thornwall Ridge. The sky was filling. The bronze dragon folded her wings and stood motionless, her eyes amber, clear, ancient, fixed on the barn. On Kess, who had emerged from the incubation chamber and was standing in the doorway, her blind head lifted, her body trembling with the force of the counter-frequency that was rolling through the ground like a continuous chord. Mother and daughter, or grandmother and granddaughter, or ancestor and descendant Hadron didn't need to check lineage records. The scale pattern, the horn placement, the jaw ridges, they were identical across the generational gap. The bronze dragon was Kess's bloodline, and she had heard the call. 14 years of patient, tireless broadcasting, and the signal had finally reached far enough. The bronze dragon turned her amber eyes to Hadron. The weight of that gaze was physical, a pressure against his skin, a heat that he felt in the bond marks on his chest. She looked at the scale pattern visible on his wrist where his sleeve had ridden up. She looked at his sunken face and his trembling hands and the way he leaned against the fence because his legs couldn't hold him steady. She looked at his keeper's jacket. The insignia faded to nothing. The leather cracked and oiled and cracked again across 30 years of wearing. She understood. Dragons read thermal signatures the way humans read faces. She could see his dropping temperature, the deficit in his metabolic output, the way his body was dimming while Kess's blazed. She could see the Ashko written on his skin and read the cost in his posture and his pulse. She knew exactly what it was, and she knew exactly what it had cost, and the expression in her amber eyes was something Hadron had never seen in a dragon's face before. She lowered her head, not submission, not greeting, acknowledgement, the gesture of a creature older than the station, older than the service, older than the protocol manuals and the bureaucratic classifications, who was looking at a human and seeing something she had been told no longer existed. A keeper. Kess walked across the yard, blind, careful, but sure. She navigated by heat mapping and memory, crossing the 20 yards of frozen ground without faltering, and she pressed her head against the bronze dragon's chest. The sound they made together was beyond hearing, a harmonic that Hadron felt in his molars and his hip joints and the marrow of his bones. A reunion vibration, compounded across 14 years of separation, and it was the most beautiful and terrible sound he had ever experienced because it meant the calling was over, and the calling was the thing that had given him purpose. And without it, he was just a man leaning on a fence dying of a bond he'd chosen with his eyes open. The 3 younger dragons circled closer. One of them, the smallest, barely larger than Kess, approached Hadron at the fence. It stopped 3 feet away and lowered its head and breathed on his hands. The breath was warm. Not dragonfire warm, but blood warm, body warm, the temperature of a living creature offering the simplest comfort it knew. The warmth seeped into his fingers and eased the tremor for the first time in days. Hadron's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and the scale pattern on his wrist caught the light, and the young dragon stared at it with an intensity that suggested it understood exactly what those marks meant. The bronze dragon detached from Kess and walked to Hadron. Each step shook the ground. She was close, now close enough that he could see the individual scales on her jaw, each one the size of his palm, burnished smooth by decades of mountain wind. Close enough to smell the mineral heat of her breath, the deep basalt scent that was the same as the incubation chamber, amplified 100-fold. She lowered her massive head to his level and held it there, her amber eyes level with his, her breath slow and warm against his face. He felt the probe, not the subaudible seeking pulse, something deeper, older, more deliberate. A thermal scan that went past skin and muscle and bone, and read the architecture of his body, the way a physician reads a chart. She held the scan for 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds Hadron felt the scale pattern on his chest flare with heat, and Kess's secondary heartbeat against his ribs stuttered and reset and steadied. The bronze dragon exhaled. A long, measured breath that carried something, not fire, not sound, but a frequency. a specific, targeted vibration that entered Hadron's body through his sternum and traveled along the bond marks like current through a wire. Every mark on his skin lit up. The smoke-blue lines blazed, and for one terrible, beautiful instant, he felt the full weight of the Ashkill, the entire exchange, the accumulated cost, the debt his body had been paying for 33 days compressed into a single moment of reckoning. And then the bronze dragon did something that the old texts had never described, because the old texts were written by scholars who had never witnessed what happens when a matriarch decides a debt is hers to settle. She took the debt. Hadron felt it leave, not gradually. All at once, like a held breath finally released. The cold that had lived in his bones for weeks lifted, and warmth flooded his body, not recycled warmth, not the echo of Kess's heat rooted through the bond. New warmth. The bronze dragon's own fire, her own metabolic reserves, poured into him through the bond marks and rebalanced the ledger in a single, staggering act of, will that cost her nothing she would miss, and gave back everything he had spent. His knees buckled. He went down, and the young dragon beside him pressed its shoulder against his chest to keep him from hitting the frozen ground. He knelt in the frost with his hands flat on the earth, and he breathed, and each breath was warm, and the scale pattern on his arm faded from blazing to steady to a quiet, persistent smoke blue that no longer pulsed with Kess's heartbeat because the circuit was no longer closed. The Ashkill had been completed, not broken, not reversed, fulfilled. The bond remained. He could still feel Kess's presence, the subaudible hum of her, a warmth at the edge of his awareness, but the cost had been paid by a power larger than either of them, and the debt was clear. The bronze dragon lifted her head and called. Not a subaudible pulse, a full voice, the chest-deep resonance of a Ketharin Ridge matriarch, a sound that Hadron had only read about in the old texts and had never expected to hear in the flesh. It rolled across the valley and bounced off the Thornwall ridges and came back as a doubled chord that made the barn windows vibrate, and the goats flatten their ears and the frost crack on the water trough. They came. Not all at once. The first was a lone male, old, his scales the deep forest green of a high-altitude forager. He dropped from the ashward spine 20 minutes after the matriarch's call, spiraling down through the thermals with the cautious approach of a dragon who has not used this corridor in years and is testing the air for memory. He landed at the far end of the calving pasture and folded his wings and stood very still, his head turning, taking in the scent and sound and thermal profile of a valley he had known before the roots shifted. Then he made a sound, a low answering tone, resonant and old, and the matriarch answered, and the exchange rang through the bedrock like a conversation between bells. 2 more came within the hour, a mated pair, their scales matching shades of copper and amber, flying in the tight parallel formation that bonded pairs maintain. They landed near the green male and greeted him with the jaw-pressed gesture that Hadron recognized from the old identification manuals, a kinship acknowledgement, a "we remember you." Then a family group. A female with 2 juveniles, her scales the same smoke blue as Kess's but darker, richer, the color of deep water. The juveniles were barely old enough to fly, their wingstrokes were choppy and irregular, and their mother corrected their approach with sharp vocal clicks that echoed off the Thornwall ridges. They landed in a tumble of wings and tails and immediately began exploring the station yard, sniffing at the barn walls, investigating the feed trough, startling the goats into a corner. More, a solitary female, scarred across her left flank, who landed heavily and limped when she walked, an old injury, healed but permanent. A pair of adolescents who circled the valley twice before committing to a landing, their caution the mark of dragons who had been born in the northern corridors and had never seen this valley before. An ancient male, his scales so dark they were nearly black, who descended slowly and touched down with exaggerated care, as if the ground might not hold. Hadron counted them, a keeper's habit as automatic as breathing, 11 by mid-morning, 14 by noon, 19 by the time the sun reached its peak and the frost was burning off the grass in patches, 26. They landed in the calving pasture, and along the ridgeline, and in the fields beyond the station, and they folded their wings and stood, and the valley filled with the humming resonance of dragons refinding a place they had been born to cross. 29, 31, 34, 35. Kes stood among them, blind, smaller than most, her smoke-blue scales shimmering with the iridescence of full health. She couldn't fly. She couldn't see. But she had called them back, and they had come, and every dragon in the valley oriented toward her the way a flock orients toward the lead bird, not because she was the strongest, but because she was the one who had never stopped saying the valley was worth returning to. One of the juveniles, a clumsy yearling with scales the color of hammered copper, broke formation and bounded across the pasture to investigate the barn. It pushed through the open doors, knocked over a stack of feed canisters, and emerged with its head dusted in protein concentrate, sneezing. Its mother made a sharp clicking sound, the draconic equivalent of "get back here," and the juvenile scrambled back to her side, trailing a cloud of supplement powder. The goats, who had retreated to the far corner of the yard, watched the scene with the flat, unimpressed stare of animals who have decided that the universe has stopped making sense, and they are no longer obligated to react. Hadron almost laughed. The sound surprised him, a rough, cracked noise, more cough than laugh, but genuine. He couldn't remember the last time he'd made that sound. Before the clutch, maybe. Before the decommission. Before the long years of maintaining a station for nobody and waiting for a purpose that everyone else had given up on. The matriarch, the bronze dragon, was watching him. He could feel her gaze without looking. The thermal weight of her attention settled on his shoulders like a hand. When he met her eyes, she dipped her head a fraction, the acknowledgement gesture again, but slower this time, held longer. Then she turned and walked to the center of the returned flock, and the dragons closed around her, and the valley resonance deepened and steadied into the continuous, living hum that the old texts called the corridor song. The sound the migration corridor made when it was occupied. The sound the Kareth Valley hadn't held in 14 years. Hadron sat on the fence rail and watched. His temperature was 98.6, dead normal, for the first time in weeks. The scale pattern on his arm had settled into a permanent, quiet smoke blue, a mark that would never fade, that would tell anyone who knew how to read it exactly what had happened in this valley and what it had cost and who had paid. His hands had stopped shaking. The exhaustion was lifting, slowly, the way fog lifts when the sun finds its angle. In the late afternoon, he went to the barn and opened the station's old logbook, the leather-bound registry, that the service required every keeper to maintain regardless of operational status. The last entry was 14 years old, in his own handwriting, the ink slightly faded but perfectly legible because he kept the book in its sealed case the way the manual specified. Station decommissioned, last clutch failed, keepers reassigned, maintaining facility pending route shift review. H. Voss, keeper, Kareth Valley Imperial Waystation. He picked up the pen. The same pen, refilled from the same ink bottle he'd maintained alongside everything else in the station, the winch, the heating coils, the thermal blankets, the feed stores, the incubation chamber, the emergency kit. Everything maintained, everything ready. For 14 years, everything ready. He wrote, Ketharin Ridge Migration Corridor re-established, 35 dragons present, waystation operational, keeper on site, H. Voss. He closed the logbook. Through the barn window, Kes was standing at the gorge's edge again, her blind face turned toward the ashward spine, the smoke blue of her scales catching the low winter sun. She wasn't calling anymore. She didn't need to. The valley was full, and the sound of 35 dragons breathing in the cold filled the air with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Hadron put on his coat, picked up the feed bucket, and went out to do the evening chores. The goats were bewildered by the company. He told them they'd get used to it. His hands were steady. The steadiness lasted. That was what surprised him most in the days that followed, not the dragons, not the logistical nightmare of housing 35 large predators in a facility built for 12, not the fact that his life had inverted itself in 33 days. What surprised him was that his hands had stopped shaking and stayed stopped, as if the tremor had belonged to a different man, and that man had quietly stepped aside. The first week after the matriarch's arrival was pure logistics, and Hadron fell into it the way a man falls into cold water. The shock lasted about 2 seconds, and then the body remembered how to swim. Feed ratios, water rotation, territorial spacing. The calving pasture could hold 8 adults comfortably. The field beyond it could manage another 12. The rest spread into the open ground between the station and the gorge, establishing the loose territorial clusters that Ketharin Ridge dragons preferred, family groups holding adjacent ground, adolescents orbiting the perimeter, the old dark-scaled male claiming a rocky outcrop near the Thornwall Ridge and settling there like a monument. The feed stores ran out on day 3. Hadron had known they would. The protein concentrate he'd maintained was formulated for convalescent dragons, not a resident population, and 35 healthy appetites went through his carefully labeled canisters like fire through dry timber. He stood in the empty storehouse that morning and looked at the bare shelves and felt the familiar pulse of a problem that needed solving more than it needed worrying about. He walked to the matriarch. She was resting in the calving pasture, her bronze scales catching the morning sun, the younger dragons arranged around her in the loose semicircle that denoted a resting formation. He stopped 10 feet away and spoke clearly, the way he'd been trained: direct address, keeper's cadence, no hesitation. I can't feed 35 of you, not from stores. The river has fish, but not enough for this many. The valley floor has game, but you'll strip it in a month. He paused. I need to know if you're staying. The matriarch lifted her head. Her amber eyes held his for a long moment. Then she turned to the northeast, toward the ashward spine, toward the valleys she had traveled to reach this place, and she made a sound. Not the seeking frequency, not the corridor song. A single, declarative note that carried the weight of a decision already made. She brought her gaze back to Hadron. He understood. They were staying. This wasn't a visit. The migration corridor was being reclaimed, and the Karath Valley was its anchor point, and the matriarch had made a choice that carried the authority of a lineage older than the service and deeper than any bureaucratic classification. All right, Hadron said, then we work. He spent that day and the next solving the food problem, the only way available to a man with 2 goats, no budget, and a station the service had classified as non-operational. He opened the old irrigation system, the network of channels that had been built to water the station's original livestock pastures, and that he had maintained, like everything else, for 14 years. The channels ran from the River Keth through a series of stone-cut sluices that could be opened or closed to direct flow. He opened 3 of them, flooding the lower pasture and the field beyond the calving fence. Within 2 days, the water attracted the first of the valley's deep pool fish, fat, cold water species that thrived in the Keth's mineral-rich current, and that migrated into flooded ground during late winter to spawn. The dragons discovered the flooded fields on the second morning, and the sight of 14 Ketharin Ridge adults wading belly-deep in icy water, striking at fish with the precise, patient focus of herons, was something Hadron watched from the barn doorway with an expression he couldn't have named if asked. The fish solved the immediate crisis. The long-term problem was bigger, and it arrived on day 39 in the form of a service transport that appeared over the Thornwall Ridge without warning. Hadron was in the yard, repairing the secondary water trough, the one the copper-scaled juvenile had cracked by standing on its edge when the transport's shadow crossed the ground. He looked up. The vehicle was a standard service long-range shuttle, gray-hulled, the regional office insignia visible on the fuselage. It circled the station once slowly, and Hadron could imagine the pilot's face as the scope of the situation below became apparent. 35 dragons in a valley that the service had classified as functionally empty. A decommissioned waystation with smoke rising from its heating vents. A single keeper standing in a yard full of feeding troughs and cargo container water basins, looking up at the transport with the calm expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had decided not to worry about it. The transport landed in the only clear space available, the narrow strip between the barn and the calving pasture. 3 people disembarked. Inspector Drell was the first, her data tablet already active, her expression the compressed neutrality of a professional who has discovered that her last inspection report was catastrophically incomplete. Behind her came a man in a senior administrator's uniform, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, the insignia of the regional director's office on his collar. The third was a woman in field medic's whites, carrying a diagnostic kit. The matriarch watched from the pasture. She did not move, but every dragon in the valley oriented toward the transport the moment it landed, and the subaudible hum that rolled through the bedrock carried a harmonic Hadron had not heard before, a low, watchful frequency, not aggressive, not welcoming, attentive. The sound of 35 dragons deciding whether the newcomers were a threat. Keeper Voss. The administrator's voice was controlled. His name tag read Selim Bren, Deputy Regional Director. My office received an unusual seismic report 3 days ago. Subaudible frequencies consistent with a large dragon population centered on this station. He looked at the valley, at the dragons, at the flooded fields where 3 adults were still fishing, apparently unconcerned by the arrival. Would you like to explain what I'm looking at? Catharin Ridge Migration Group, Hadron said. 35 individuals. They arrived 6 days ago. This station is decommissioned. The dragons didn't get the memo. Bren's jaw tightened. Drell was already moving, her tablet scanning the yard, the barn, the feeding equipment. The field medic stood at the transport's ramp, staring at the matriarch with the wide-eyed look of someone who has studied dragon anatomy in classrooms and is now seeing a full-grown bronze Catharin Ridge matriarch at 40 feet for the first time. Inspector Drell filed a report 12 days ago classifying this facility as maintained, non-operational, with no dragon activity. Bren's voice was precise. That report is now significantly inaccurate. The dragons arrived after her inspection. And you didn't contact the regional office. Hadron met his gaze. I was busy keeping them alive. The words hung in the cold air. Bren studied Hadron's face, the weathered lines, the calm eyes, the keeper's jacket worn to a ghost of its original condition. His gaze dropped to Hadron's wrist, where the sleeve had shifted and the smoke blue scale pattern was visible, the lines dark and permanent against the skin. What is that? Bren asked quietly. Ashkill marks. I bonded with the first dragon. She's blind, flightless, Catharin Ridge subspecies. She's the one who called them back. Bren was silent for a long time. The wind blew across the valley, carrying the mineral scent of the river and the deep, layered warmth of 35 dragon bodies breathing in the February cold. Drell had stopped scanning and was standing very still, her tablet lowered, listening. The Ashkill hasn't been documented in over a century, Bren said. It has now. The medic examined him that afternoon in the barn, with Kess lying 3 feet away, and refusing to let anyone approach Hadron without her thermal scan clearing them first. The medic, her name was Saren Kale, was gentle and methodical, and the readings she took from the scale pattern on Hadron's chest, an arm made her go quiet in the particular way that medical professionals go quiet when the data is telling them something textbooks said was impossible. Your metabolic baseline has shifted, she said. Your resting body temperature is 99.2. That's half a degree above human normal, and the thermal pattern, she pressed the scanner against the marks on his forearm. These aren't surface pigmentation. The pattern extends into the dermal layer. It's generating heat independently of your circulatory system. Is it dangerous? I have no idea. No one alive has studied an Ashkill bond in a living subject. She looked at Kess. At the smoke-blue scales, the blind white eyes, the way Kess's head tracked Hadron's breathing. How did you survive it? The historical records suggest the metabolic deficit should have killed you. The matriarch settled the debt. Saren stared at him. Then she looked out the barn window at the bronze dragon in the pasture, and her expression shifted into something that wasn't clinical anymore, something closer to reverence. Bren spent 2 days at the station. He inspected everything: the heating system, the water channels, the feeding infrastructure, the improvised troughs, the cargo winch, the incubation chamber. He interviewed Hadron for 4 hours, recording every detail of the 33 days on his tablet with the meticulous thoroughness of a man building a case. Hadron told him everything: the gorge, the hypothermia, the blankets, the inspection he'd hidden Kess from, the Ashkill, the calling, the matriarch's arrival, the debt settled. On the second evening, Bren stood in the barn doorway and watched the valley. The sun was dropping behind the ashward spine, and the last light caught the dragons in the fields: bronze and copper and smoke blue and forest green and slate gray and hammered gold, scattered across the valley floor like coins on a dark cloth, each one a living furnace breathing heat into the February air. The corridor song hummed through the bedrock. Kess stood at the gorge's edge, and beside her the young copper-scaled juvenile who had knocked over the feed canisters was trying to catch fish in the flooded field and failing spectacularly, lunging and missing and emerging with a face full of mud. And the low clicking sound from the matriarch, the draconic equivalent of laughter, carried across the yard. The service decommissioned this station 14 years ago, Bren said. He wasn't looking at Hadron, he was looking at the valley. The classification was functionally absent. The budget was reallocated. The keepers were reassigned. The decision was made by people who read climate data and population models and decided that the Karath Valley corridor was finished. He paused. They were wrong. Hadron said nothing. He didn't need to. Bren turned to face him. I'm going to file a reactivation request, full operational status, staffing for 6 keepers, which is what this station was built for. Feed budget, medical supplies, infrastructure repair. The regional director will push back. The budget committee will push back harder. But the seismic data doesn't lie, and 35 dragons don't lie, and he glanced at the Ashkill marks on Hadron's wrist. And a documented 4th stage bond with a living keeper doesn't lie. I don't need 6 keepers, Hadron said. You need at least 3. You can barely stand some mornings. Don't argue with me, I've watched you grip the doorframe every time you walk through it. Bren's voice softened a fraction. You kept this station operational for 14 years with no staff, no budget, and no reason anyone else could see. You can let someone help. Hadron looked at the valley, at the dragons, at Kess, who was walking back from the gorge's edge with the juvenile beside her, the young dragon matching her pace, adjusting its stride to hers, guiding her around obstacles with small nudges of its shoulder the way Hadron had seen bond-paired dragons guide each other in the old training films. Someone had taught the juvenile to do that. Hadron hadn't, which meant the matriarch had. 3 keepers, Hadron said. I pick them. Bren almost smiled, agreed. The transport left the next morning. Bren, Drell, and the medic lifted off in the gray dawn, the shuttle's engine scattering frost from the grass as it climbed. Hadron stood in the yard and watched it go, the way he had watched Drell's transport go 12 days earlier, except this time his heartbeat was steady and his hands were still, and the valley behind him was full of sleeping dragons. The reactivation orders arrived 11 days later, delivered by the same courier drone that had brought the inspection notice. Hadron read them standing in the barn doorway, Kess at his side, the morning sun warming the smoke blue of her scales. The orders were thorough, full operational status effective immediately, staffing authorization for 4 keepers. Bren had negotiated an extra, supply shipments beginning within the month, infrastructure repair budget approved, and a final line handwritten in the margin in what Hadron recognized as Bren's precise script: station designation updated. Kareth Valley Imperial Waystation. Active. Keeper in charge, Hadron Voss. He read the line twice. Keeper in charge. Not last remaining keeper. Not exemption status pensioner. Keeper in charge. The title he had earned 30 years ago and had carried alone for 14, through empty winters and silent springs and the mechanical discipline of maintaining a purpose that everyone but him had abandoned. Kes pressed her head against his hip. The subaudible pulse that traveled through his body was warm and steady, not the seeking frequency, not the distress call, not the broadcast. The settled hum. The sound of a dragon who is exactly where she belongs, beside the person she trusts, in the place she called the world back to. He folded the orders and put them in his jacket pocket, beside the old inspection notice he'd never thrown away. The jacket was cracked and faded, and the insignia was a ghost of itself, but the leather still smelled of keeper's oil and feed dust, and the mineral warmth of heated basalt, and it fit the way a thing fits when it has been worn every day for 30 years by a man who never stopped believing it mattered. That night he did something he hadn't done in years. He sat down at the station's communication desk, a heavy wooden table with an old short-range transmitter bolted to its surface, the kind the service had issued to remote stations before satellite uplinks replaced them, and he composed a letter, not to the service, to Torrin Gale. He kept it short. Torrin was not a man who appreciated excess words. You asked what the sound was. It wasn't the generator. Come see for yourself. Bring grain, the goats are running low and I can't get to town. Hadron. He sent it on the station's courier frequency, the one Torrin monitored for emergency weather alerts, and he went to bed. Kes was in the incubation chamber, her breathing deep and steady, the corridor song humming through the basalt floor in a continuous low chord that made the walls vibrate like the body of a struck instrument. The sound should have kept him awake. It didn't. He slept better than he had in months, dreamless and still, and when his alarm sounded at 5, he swung his legs off the cot and stood up without dizziness and walked to the barn without stopping. Torrin arrived the next afternoon. He rode up the station road on his pack horse, 2 bags of grain slung across the saddle, and he stopped at the gate and sat there for a full minute without moving. His face did something that Hadron had never seen it do in 20 years of acquaintance. It opened. The tight, weathered mask of a man who kept his reactions behind his jaw dropped away, and underneath it was something raw and wondering, the expression of a child seeing something for the first time that it had been told didn't exist. The calving pasture held 8 adults and 3 juveniles, all resting in the late afternoon warmth. The matriarch was on the far ridgeline, her bronze scales catching the sun like a signal fire. 2 adolescents were play-fighting near the gorge, their tails lashing, their claws retracted, the mock combat producing a series of thuds and clicks that echoed off the thornwall ridges. Kes was in the yard, her blind head lifted toward the sound of Torrin's horse. "That's not a generator," Torrin said. "No," Hadron said. Torrin dismounted. He unloaded the grain without speaking, carried both bags to the feed storehouse, stacked them in the corner beside the last of the protein concentrate canisters, and came back outside. He stood in the yard and looked at the valley the way Hadron imagined the first keepers had looked at it 3,000 years ago, when the Ketharin Ridge migration corridor was new, and the world had not yet decided it was obsolete. "How long?" Torrin asked. "Since February." 35. 37 now. 2 more came in yesterday from the north, a mated pair. Torrin looked at Hadron's wrist, where the sleeve had ridden up and the scale pattern was visible. He didn't ask what it was. Torrin Gale was not a man who asked questions he could answer with his own eyes. He studied the marks for 5 seconds, then looked at Hadron's face, the color back in his cheeks, the steadiness in his hands, the calm alertness in his eyes that had replaced the hollow exhaustion of 3 weeks ago. "You look better," Torrin said. "I am better." Torin nodded once. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bottle, the dark, heavy glass of valley-distilled grain spirit, the kind the goat farmers brewed in their root cellars and shared only with people they considered worth the effort. He set it on the fence post. "Congratulations," he said. And then, because he was Torin, he mounted his horse and rode out without another word. But at the gate he stopped and turned and looked back at the valley one more time, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to a smile that Hadron had ever seen him produce. Spring came 3 weeks later. The frost broke. The irrigation channels ran clear. The first grass of the season pushed through the mud in the calving pasture, and the valley floor turned from white and brown to a tentative, stubborn green. The dragons spread with the thaw, the family groups claiming traditional nesting sites along the gorge's upper rim, the adolescents ranging farther into the Ashward Spine's foothills, the matriarch holding the central ground around the station with the quiet authority of a creature who has reclaimed something ancient and does not intend to let it go. The first supply shipment arrived in early March, 2 weeks before the first keeper. 3 cargo pallets dropped by service transport protein, concentrate in industrial-scale drums, mineral supplements, medical supplies, replacement cable for the winch, thermal blankets in quantities that made Hadron's carefully hoarded emergency stash look like a child's collection. He stood in the storehouse, surrounded by more supplies than the station had ever held, and felt something settle in his chest, not relief, exactly, but the loosening of a tension he hadn't known he was carrying. The tension of doing everything alone. The knowledge that if he failed, no one was coming to pick up the work. Someone was coming now. The first new keeper arrived in late March. A young woman named Lauren Cade, 24, freshly certified, with the particular brightness in her eyes that Hadron recognized from 30 years ago in his own mirror. She stepped off the supply transport with a regulation kit bag and a brand new keeper's jacket, and she looked at the valley, at the dragons fishing in the flooded fields, at the matriarch sunning on the warm basalt, at the juvenile chasing the goats in a circle that both parties seemed to be enjoying, and her mouth opened and nothing came out. "You'll get used to it," Hadron told her, the same words he'd said to the goats. He showed her the station, the barn, the incubation chamber, the heating coils, the winch, the thermal sensors, the cargo netting, the feed stores, every piece of equipment he'd maintained for 14 years, every system he'd kept operational on pension-funded supplies and habit, and a faith that no one else shared. He showed her the logbook, the 14-year gap between entries, and the single line that closed it. He showed her Kess. The blind dragon was resting in the incubation chamber, her preferred spot, the warm stone floor radiating the basalt mineral heat she had chosen the first night and never abandoned. Kess lifted her head when they entered and turned her white eyes toward Lauren, and the thermal probe she sent the body heat scan. The slow assessment made Lauren go very still. "She's mapping you," Hadron said. "Stand quiet. Let her work." Lauren stood quiet. Kess scanned her for 15 seconds. Then the blind dragon made a sound, the short, warm exhalation, not quite a purr, not quite a sigh. The sound of recognition, or maybe acceptance. Lauren's eyes went bright and wet, and she wiped them quickly with the back of her hand, and Hadron pretended not to notice because he remembered what it felt like the first time a dragon acknowledged you as something other than furniture. "She approved you," he said. "That's not nothing. She rejected the cargo pilot this morning, sent a distress pulse that rattled his teeth until he backed out of the barn." Lauren laughed. The sound was bright and unguarded in the warm chamber, and Kess turned her blind eyes toward it with an expression that looked, to Hadron, remarkably like curiosity. The second keeper came a week later, Davin Marsh, 31, a former livestock veterinarian who had retrained through the service's emergency certification program after the Karath Valley reactivation made the news. He was quiet, methodical, and he had the particular gentleness of a man who had spent years handling animals in pain. He took to the dragons the way water takes to a channel naturally, without resistance, as if his hands had been shaped for exactly this work and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. The third arrived in April. Ren Solek, 28, who had been a structural engineer before the service recruited him for his expertise in basalt construction and thermal systems. He looked at the station's heating coils and the jury-rigged cable extensions and the cargo container water troughs and said, with a reverence that Hadron found both gratifying and slightly embarrassing, "You built all of this yourself." "I maintained what was here. I improvised what wasn't." "The cable routing through the wall conduit, that's not in the service manual." "The service manual doesn't cover hiding a dragon from an inspector." Ren stared at him. Then he grinned, the sudden, uncontrollable grin of a man who has just realized that the job he signed up for is going to be significantly more interesting than the job description suggested. Hadron trained them the way he'd been trained Keeper's protocol, the steady narration, the patient rhythms that let a dragon decide you were safe. He taught them to read thermal scans and subaudible frequencies, and the subtle shifts in a dragon's posture that telegraphed mood and intent. He taught them that the work was maintenance, not glamour, not adventure, not the dramatic rescues that the recruitment materials implied. The work was feeding and cleaning, and calibrating and repairing, and standing in a cold barn at 5 in the morning breaking ice on a water trough. The work was showing up. Each of them found their rhythm. Lauren had a gift for the subaudible frequencies. She could distinguish individual dragons by their pulse signatures within a week, a skill that normally took months to develop. Davin's veterinary training translated directly to dragon medicine. He took over the health monitoring, and within a month had established a baseline assessment for every dragon in the valley, filed in the meticulous charts that the service required, and that Hadron had been too exhausted and too alone to compile. Ren redesigned the heating system, rerouted the water channels, reinforced the barn roof where 3 decades of weather and the occasional dragon landing had weakened the joists. They were young and eager, and they had the particular dedication of people who had chosen this profession, not for the pay, which was terrible, but for the thing itself. By May, the station was running at a level it hadn't reached in 14 years. 4 keepers on rotation, equipment maintained on schedule rather than by one man's stubborn will. The dragons logged and tracked and fed with a regularity that made the old text descriptions of a functioning waystation seem not like history but like prophecy. The nesting season started in early June. Hadron felt it before he saw it, a shift in the valley's resonance, a deepening of the corridor song that carried new harmonics he hadn't heard in the weeks since the matriarch's arrival. The dragons were restless. The family groups drew closer together. The adolescents stopped their ranging and returned to the central ground. The matriarch walked the gorge's upper rim each morning, testing the thermal profile of the basalt shelves with the deliberate attention of a creature evaluating real estate. Lauren noticed it too. She came to Hadron on a Tuesday morning with her frequency log open, pointing at a pattern in the subaudible data. The seeking pulse has changed. It's not outward anymore, it's cycling internally, between the females. They're synchronizing. "Nesting preparation," Hadron said. The words came out steady, but something moved in his chest, a weight, a memory. The incubation chamber. 6 eggs on the warm stone. The sound of a thermal signature dimming. "Have you done this before?" Lauren asked. "Once," he said. "It didn't go well." She waited. He didn't elaborate. She had the sense not to push. Smoke blue female, the one with the deep water scales, and the 2 juveniles, was the first to nest. She chose a shelf on the gorge's upper rim, a natural alcove in the basalt that faced south and caught the morning sun. Hadron watched her prepare the site from the station yard, his old field binoculars pressed to his eyes, and the precision of her work was something he recognized in his own bones, the same methodical care he brought to maintaining the heating coils and the winch cable and the incubation chamber. She cleared loose stone. She tested the thermal signature of the basalt with her belly, lying flat against it for minutes at a time, reading the heat the way Hadron read a temperature scanner. She lined the alcove with dried grass carried from the pasture, weaving it into a shallow bowl with her claws and the curved edge of her jaw. 3 days later, she laid 2 eggs. Hadron saw them from the ridgeline, 2 pale, blue-veined ovals, each the size of a man's head, nestled in the grass-lined hollow of the alcove. The female was curled around them, her tail forming the outer wall of the nest, her body heat radiating outward in visible waves that made the air above the alcove shimmer. Her eyes were half closed, and the sound she made a low, continuous hum, not the corridor song but something more intimate, more focused, was the sound of a dragon doing the oldest work of her species. Hadron sat on the ridgeline and watched. The binoculars shook in his hands, and he set them down because the shaking wasn't from cold or exhaustion or the ashkel. It was from something else. He pressed his palms flat against the basalt and felt the nesting hum travel through the stone, and the scale pattern on his arm resonated with it. And for the first time in 14 years, the memory of Soreth's clutch did not arrive as grief. It arrived as continuity. The same stone, the same warmth, the same ancient, patient process of life, deciding that a place was worth investing in. Davin ran the first health check on the eggs 2 days later, approaching the nest with the keeper's narration and the careful, non-threatening posture that Hadron had drilled into all 3 of them. The female watched him with amber eyes, her body tense, her tail curling tighter around the eggs. He scanned from 4 feet away, close enough for the embryonic scanner to register, far enough to give her room. "Both viable," he reported to Hadron that evening, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of a professional who is very aware that viable is not the same as guaranteed. Internal temperatures are strong, consistent, no signs of shell contamination. No contamination. Hadron heard the word and felt something release in his chest that had been locked for 14 years. The fungal infection that had killed Soreth's clutch, the invisible systemic rot that had taken 6 lives before anyone knew it was absent. These eggs were clean. The second nest appeared a week later, then a third. By mid-June, 5 females had laid a total of 11 eggs along the gorge's upper rim, and the valley's resonance had shifted into something new, a frequency the old texts called the hatching vigil, the deep, sustained chord that a population maintains when its future is incubating in the stone, and every adult is attuned to the temperature, and the timing and the slow, miraculous mathematics of embryonic development. Hadron assigned watches. Keeper's protocol for active nesting, 1 observer per nest during daylight hours, thermal readings every 6 hours, a runner between nests to coordinate data. The 3 new keepers threw themselves into the rotation with the intensity of people who understood that they were participating in something that had not happened in this valley for over a decade. Lurin took the dawn shift and sat on the ridgeline with her frequency log, tracking the subaudible patterns of the nesting females, building a dataset that no one in the service had ever compiled for a wild Ketharan Ridge population. Davin monitored the embryonic development, running his scans with the steady hands and focused attention that made the nesting females tolerate his presence even at their most protective. Wren reinforced the ridgeline path, cutting steps into the basalt so the keepers could reach the nest safely in wet weather. And Hadron walked between them. The keepers walked the steady, measured circuit that connected every station, every nest, every trough and gate and sluice, the daily verification that the system was holding. His legs no longer faltered. His hands no longer shook. The ashkel marks on his arm pulsed faintly with the hatching vigil frequency, a warmth that reminded him with each step that he was connected to something larger than his own body, larger than the station, larger than the 14 years of silence that had preceded this spring. Day 72 of the first clutch arrived on an August morning so still that the smoke from the barn's heating vents rose straight up into a sky the color of hammered steel. Hadron was on the ridgeline at dawn, the way he had been every dawn for the last week, watching the smoke blue females nest through his binoculars. The eggs had been rocking since Tuesday, the gentle, rhythmic motion he remembered from Sareth's clutch, the motion that meant the hatchlings were testing their shells, preparing to break through. Each rock sent a vibration through the basalt shelf that traveled down through the ridgeline and into Hadron's boots and up through his legs and into the scale pattern on his arm, where it registered as a faint, rhythmic warmth, a second pulse, tiny and insistent, saying, "I'm here, I'm ready." The first crack appeared at 7:12 in the morning. Hadron saw it through the binoculars, a dark line splitting the pale shell, no wider than a hair, running from the crown of the egg toward the base. The female lifted her head and stared at the egg, her body absolutely still, her amber eyes focused with an intensity that made the air around the nest seem to tighten. The crack widened. A piece of shell the size of a thumbnail fell away, and through the gap Hadron could see movement, wet, dark, the gleam of something scaled pressing against the interior surface. The hatchling pushed. The crack spread. The shell rocked harder, the rhythm accelerating, and the female made a sound, a single, rising note, clear and bright, that carried across the gorge and brought every dragon in the valley to attention. Lurin was beside Hadron on the ridgeline. She had arrived without speaking, her frequency log clutched to her chest, her eyes wide. Davin was on the path below, his medical kit ready. Holding position at the distance Hadron had specified close enough to intervene if the hatchling struggled, far enough to let the mother work. The shell broke at 7:19. It didn't shatter, it opened, the two halves falling apart like a book laying flat, and the hatchling spilled out onto the grass-lined nest in a wet, dark tumble of limbs and wings and tail. It was small, barely larger than a house cat, its scales slick with embryonic fluid, their color impossible to determine beneath the wet. Its eyes were closed. Its wings were folded tight against its body, the membranes translucent, veined with the branching pattern of new capillaries. It lay on its side in the nest and breathed one breath, two, the tiny ribcage expanding and contracting with the uncertain rhythm of lungs that had never tasted air before. Then it opened its eyes, dark amber, clear, bright. It looked up at its mother, who was looking down at it with the ancient, knowing stillness of a creature who has done this before and who recognizes the moment for what it is, the instant when the future stops being theoretical and becomes real. The hatchling made a sound, a thin, wavering note barely audible, the seeking frequency, scaled down to the size of a newborn, asking the first question every dragon asks, "Are you here?" The mother answered, a low, warm pulse that rolled through the nest and into the basalt and down through the ridgeline and into Hadron's boots. "I'm here." The second egg cracked at 7:31. By 8 o'clock, both hatchlings were alive and breathing and nursing against their mother's belly, their tiny claws gripping the gaps between her scales, their dark amber eyes blinking in the morning light. Their scales were drying, and as the embryonic fluid evaporated, the color emerged smoke blue, the same deep, storm-edge iridescence that marked every Ketharan Ridge dragon in the valley, the same color as Kess. Hadron lowered the binoculars. His face was wet and he did not wipe it. Lurin was crying beside him, openly, without embarrassment, her frequency log forgotten in her lap. From somewhere below, he heard Davin's voice, quiet and professional, reporting into his comm unit. 2 live hatches, smoke blue Ketharan Ridge, both stable, both feeding. Time of first hatch, 07:19. The matriarch's call rolled through the valley. The full-voice resonance, the chest-deep note that Hadron had heard only once before on the day she arrived. It shook the ridgeline. It shook the barn. It shook the water in the troughs and the glass in the windows and the bones in Hadron's chest. And from every corner of the valley, from the gorge and the pastures and the ashward spine's foothills, the dragons answered. 43 voices, joined in a single chord that made the air itself vibrate, a sound so deep and wide that Hadron felt it not in his ears but in the spaces between his cells. The hatching song. The old texts described it as the rarest sound in the keeper's experience, The full population announcement that the corridor has produced new life, that the investment of migration and nesting and vigil has been justified. The Karath Valley had not heard it in over 14 years. Hadron sat on the ridgeline and listened. The scale pattern on his arm was warm, not pulsing, not flaring, just warm, the steady temperature of a bond that has settled into its permanent frequency. Through the bond he could feel Kess, somewhere in the valley below, her blind head lifted, her voice added to the chord, the seeking frequency that had once been a lonely signal broadcast into empty stone, now woven into a sound so full that the word lonely no longer had any meaning in this valley. 11 eggs across 5 nests. Over the next 3 weeks, 9 of them hatched. 2 did not, one unfertilized, one that had stopped developing in its 6th week, the tiny thermal signature fading the way Hadron remembered, the wet settling sound that he heard in his sleep. But 9 lived. 9 dark-eyed, smoke-blue, copper-scaled, forest-green, slate-gray hatchlings that tumbled out of their shells and into a valley that was ready for them, a valley with keepers and feed stores and heating coils and water channels, and a population of adults who greeted each new arrival with the hatching song and the seeking pulse and the ancient, unbroken promise that this place would hold. The station log grew. Hadron wrote in it each evening, the pen moving across the page in the steady handwriting of a man who has found, after 14 years of silence, that he has things worth recording. Hatch dates, weights, temperatures, growth rates. The small, specific details that the service required, and that Hadron provided not because they were required, but because they mattered. Each data point of proof that the valley was alive, that the corridor was functioning, that the work of maintenance had been worth every frozen morning and every empty year. Hadron stood in the yard on a morning in late August and watched the valley. The grass was high in the calving pasture. The river ran green and slow between the basalt walls of the gorge, the summer warmth having tamed the spring torrent to a patient, glittering current. The dragons, 52 now, counting the 9 hatchlings, moved through the valley with the unhurried rhythm of a population that has reclaimed its home ground and begun the work of growing. The matriarch was teaching the older juveniles to hunt the upper slopes, her bronze form visible against the gray rock of the ashward spine, patient and precise. The old dark-scaled male on his thornwall outcrop had been joined by 2 younger males who had apparently decided he was worth learning from. The smoke-blue female and her 2 new hatchlings were sunning on the gorge's upper rim, the young ones wrestling clumsily on the warm basalt, while their mother watched with the half-closed eyes of a parent who has learned that intervention is less effective than exhaustion. Kess was in the pasture. She couldn't fly, couldn't see, couldn't hunt. But she walked the valley every morning with the copper-scaled juvenile at her shoulder, the young dragon who had appointed itself her guide without being asked, matching her pace, steering her away from obstacles, waiting when she stopped to lift her nose to the wind and read the valley's thermals the way a sighted dragon reads the sky. She navigated by heat and sound, and the deep knowledge of a creature who had spent her entire life in this valley and knew its every stone by touch. She was humming, not the seeking call, not the broadcast. The corridor song the same continuous, living frequency that rolled through the bedrock when the migration route was occupied. She was adding her voice to the chorus, and the sound blended with the 51 other voices until the valley itself seemed to vibrate with a warmth that went deeper than temperature and older than language. Lurin came out of the barn carrying 2 feed buckets. She stopped beside Hadron and looked at the valley. "It's something," she said. Hadron nodded. The scale pattern on his arm caught the morning light, the permanent smoke-blue lines, quiet now, no longer pulsing, just present. A record written on his skin that said, a man stayed at his post for 14 years because he believed a valley could remember what it was, and it remembered. He took one of the feed buckets from Lurin. The goats were waiting at the fence, their expressions the practiced look of animals who have learned that a yard full of dragons is simply the new normal, and breakfast is still the most important event of the day. He fed them. Then he walked the station perimeter the way he did every morning, checking the fences, the troughs, the sluice gates, the heating vents, the work of maintenance. The keeper's work, which was not dramatic and not glamorous, and not the sort of thing that made for good stories, except that it was the only work that mattered, the quiet, patient, daily act of keeping something alive long enough for the world to remember it needed it. The valley hummed, the dragons breathed, the station held. Hadron Voss, keeper in charge of the Kareth Valley Imperial Waystation, walked his rounds in the morning sun, and the warmth on his face was the valley's, and the warmth in his chest was Kess's, and the warmth in his hands was his own.